All right. So now, what I would like to do is to take a pause in between my videos about Joseph Campbell. In between, we left off with primitive mythology last time, so now we're in between primitive mythology and Oriental mythology. But I got curious about Ken Wilber's Up from Eden, which is a book of his that I'd never read. Read a few of his books, but not this one. Up from Eden, a transpersonal view of human evolution, which he wrote, he says, in 1977, and it came out, I think, in 81, and so that he basically wrote it when he was 30, so right about on his Saturn return. Saturn takes 29 years to go around the sun. He does not believe in astrology, by the way. I think he's missed the boat on that. I've studied astrology for decades, and it most certainly does work. And I don't think that Wilber is comfortable with astrology because astrology eludes capture by the intellect. You cannot reduce astrology to your mistress, your slave, and dominate over her. She is Tyche. She is the goddess of fortune, and she rules and allots all things. She is mightier than you and your tiny little brain. And I think Wilber just resents that there's no way to really take astrology and capture it and turn it into concepts that make everything work like a machine. That's all he does here with these states of consciousness, is kind of makes them work, gives them a kind of machinery. And I also don't think, though, that, I mean, if you ask how astrology works, I don't think anybody knows how it works. They just know that it does. Somebody like Rick Tarnas out at California Institute of Integral Studies will try and tell you that he thinks he knows how it works. It's based on synchronicities. It absolutely is not. Tarnas has totally failed to understand the concept of a synchronicity. A synchronicity is unexpected and unpredictable. In the Jungian world, synchronicities are surprises that pop up into your world, echoes that sound like another world is involved in what's going on here. Motifs echo, and it's a surprise. You cannot predict a synchronicity. And astrology is based on making predictions, so Tarnas's theory is wrong. But there's no need to explain it. We just know that it works. We don't need an explanation. I think, though, that it must work somehow in terms of, like David Bohm's implicate order, where it's a deep unfolding. Somehow there's an order to the world that matches the destinies of our souls, which are incarnate in physical bodies from another world, and it matches the unfold. And somehow our lives unfold organically, like an Indian lotus opening up its petals bit by bit, and each level has another level of order and symmetry in there that's beautiful. The way these planets work. So, anyhow, that's a footnote. Moving on then to Wilber's book here. I'm not a huge fan of Wilber. I think everybody knows that, but I want to give him a due hearing. I'm interested in his model. I don't think he's a very good writer. I think his prose style is clunky and awkward and a bit irritating. Some of his jokes are a little silly. But suffice it to say that he begins in this book by talking about what he calls the Perennial Philosophy. Now, the Perennial Philosophy, which he says that he is an adherent of here, is this idea that there's another world. There's an absolute. He borrows the term from Hegel and Schelling, the absolute, which Schelling invented, by the way, and Hegel stole it from him and made it famous in the Phenomenology of Spirit. But it was Schelling who originated it when they were rooming together. And Schelling talks about, in the ages of the world, how the absolute is basically God for him, with three different hypostases, three different energies. So for him, the absolute was identical with God. And sometimes it can be thought of as God, although it's hazardous to do so, because that gets into the idea of our cultural interpretations and misinterpretations of what might that force might be. It's probably just best to think of God as an absolute energy that powers the universe, neither male nor female, loving, divine, absolute. So the absolute is probably a pretty good term for it. So the idea in the Perennial Philosophy is that all of these great civilizations have had some esoteric tradition of one or another which involves figuring out a means of facilitating how the human being can jack into the divine. Like one of William Gibson's characters jacking into cyberspace. That's what we do. We jack into the divine using various modus operandi from these high civilizations, which have enabled us to facilitate that access in various ways. And there's this ground of being. It's absolute. Everything has come out of it. Everything is it. Everything is made of it. We're all part of it. And it's this idea of this oneness, this cosmic oneness. I'm okay with that. I suppose it probably is about right. The only problem with this idea now of a perennial philosophy is that it kind of really oversimplifies all of the complexities of these various civilizations and how they access the divine and mashes them together into a single idea that we're all just accessing the one, like Plotinus' one with a capital O, the one. But that misses a lot of the complexities and the different contexts. And I think this is the big problem with Wilber. Context. He ignores context. Is that you end up with this idea that you lose all the different connotations, the different reasons why the Chinese have come up with the idea of the Tao, for instance, as their ultimate transcendental signified, or why the Hindus have come up with Brahman as their ultimate transcendental signified, which Wilber is basically calling here Atman. They're the same thing, so that's correct. And that idea was originated in about 800 BC by Yajnavalkya in the Chandogya Upanishad, the earliest of the Upanishads, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, and he overturned the Brahmins' officially sanctioned state worship of the gods in the Vedas by offering them ghee sacrifices, using a type of purified butter to pour into the fire and offer them sacrifices. And Yajnavalkya said, no, you don't have to do this. What it's really about is realizing Atman within. Atman is this groundless ground of being that is the same within you as it is out there. We just call it Brahman out there to unify all things, and we call it Atman in here. And Brahmatman is the ultimate realization of the unity of the two. That is the goal of Indian yoga. So the perennial philosophy and this idea, I think one of the problems I have with Wilber, and it's a big one, is that what he's doing here, some of it's right, but some of it is just decidedly not right and is a little bit pathologically his own version of this idea of the evolution of consciousness over time, is that he's taken all these different signifiers, religious signifiers from different civilizations, like Brahman or Atman from India, or the Tao from China, or a lot of Buddhist terms, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and so forth. He's taken a lot of different Buddhist terms, and a lot of terms from Gene Gebster's book, The Ever-Present Origin, which was written by him in 1949, and sort of just mashed them together. He's deworlded all of these terms and put them into what Heidegger would call Vorhandenheit mode, which is an abstract intellectual phase space full of signifiers that have been deworlded. In other words, they've been removed from the context of the local horizons of meaning that brought them into being and that give them all these special particular connotations because of the fact that they have a history behind them coming out of that region, from mind to mind to mind within that civilization. Wilber doesn't do that. He takes them all, rips them out of their context. He's not interested in context, mashes them together to create his own system, which exists in an abstract hyperphase space that I think only exists in his brain. I don't think it has a lot to do with what's going on out there. Some of it is right. I think the basic idea is right, that consciousness has evolved from the absolute to the world of matter, from out of which it has concrete. And from out of that then comes animate life with all of its basic levels. He calls this in the foreword that he wrote, the new foreword, or the foreword to the later edition, borrowing a term from Arthur Kessler called holons. Each thing is contained within the next thing that comes along and swallows it up and engulfs it and transcends, but includes the earlier levels, such as Lynn Margulis's wonderful research on bacteria, where she found out that the mitochondria in bacteria that harness oxygen were once free-living microbes, and the same thing with chloroplasts in plant cells were also once free-living microbes. Mitochondria have different DNA from the DNA that's in the nucleus, and so she suspected, and she pretty much figured out that there's been a holonic process of organisms swallowing up other organisms and including them inside of a larger architecture. History and evolution has proceeded that way. Wilber has this correct, I think. So that's this idea of the holonic architecture of how things have evolved. And so he quotes Plotinus to the effect that, moving on to his next idea here about recapturing and retrieving the great chain of being, is that man is halfway between the beasts and the gods. This is what Plotinus said, which is an idea that got reiterated brilliantly and beautifully in the Renaissance in Pico della Mirandola's text on the oration of the dignity of man, which is still, I think, the greatest and most seminal text that captures in a very short, beautiful, lyrical text on the Great Chain of Being. Arthur Lovejoy has a book about it that's not very readable. It's a much later book written in the 20th century that's not particularly good. It's okay. I would read Pico della Mirandola if you want the real thing. So Wilber has come along and he says, the Great Chain of Being. This is my model. It's hierarchical, it's vertical, and then note that Deleuze and Guattari would come in and say, therefore it's arborescent. So you've created a plane of organization, but they want to know where the rhizome is. Where is the plane of consistency that can get in and disrupt and interrupt this? And indeed, Wilber does say in the introduction that one of the traits of the Great Chain of Being is that the lower orders, the earlier ones, can come up and hijack the more recent ones, as you get in the case, he says, of the Nazis in Auschwitz, where the earlier level of tribalism came up into the mental consciousness structure and hijacked it with ethnocentrism and bad ideas about Blut and Boden. I think that's basically correct. I'm willing to go along with that. So the Great Chain of Being, so he has this idea then that everything has come out of the absolute, and he's got this model that he's created, his version of a model, which he thinks, by the way, he was the first to do, and he absolutely is not, where he has these 8, he's got this written in a circle, and he has these 8 levels to his version of the Great Chain of Being, which moves from the pre-personal to the personal to the transpersonal, or the subconscious to the self-conscious to the superconscious, which is perhaps correct. And then he's broken it down into the first level being nature. Physical nature in the lower forms, plurimatic, material, Ouroboros, reptilian. So this is the basal world of atoms and particles and molecules and everything that's going along, creating and inventing things as it moves along, but no life yet. And then the second level is body, where we get the highest bodily forms, especially typhonic, but for some bizarre reason he equates this with the magical. I don't understand that. So the magical is a term that he has ripped. He does a lot of, what the guys in the music have been doing for a couple of decades now, where you rip other songs and you rip pieces and quotes from them and mix them in. It's kind of mash up, cut and mix, rip and burn. Where he's stolen Gebser's idea of the magical and put it here as equating it with the bodily realm, which makes no sense to me. The magical structure has nothing to do with the body. It's tribal. It has to do with shamanism. It has to do with seeing the world in terms of a magical point-like unity where everything is connected by what Bruce Chatwin called song lines for the Australian Aborigines, or etheric energy patterns. Everything is connected. So the principle is, if I do one thing here, I can generate magically an effect over there. If I want to hunt a gazelle, I make an image of a gazelle, throw a spear at it, and I go get the gazelle because I created the magical code to make that happen. That's the magical consciousness structure. I don't know why he equates it with the body. The next up, we have the early mind, which is verbal, mythical, membership, paleological, and bicameral. So he's read Julian Jaynes. He's bringing in Julian Jaynes's origins and breakdown of bicameral mind here and equating it basically correctly with the mythical, I suppose, as early mind. And the rational, Gebser's mental consciousness structure here then at the top becomes equated with advanced mind, rational, mental, egoic, and self-reflexive. That's fine. But then we get into problems here with these latter 4 consciousness structures, which he calls psychic, subtle, causal, and ultimate. And he says that he follows Gebser up to this point, and then Gebser's integral doesn't do it for him. He didn't think it made enough distinctions between these various different types of the world of the spirit and spirituality. So he's taken the integral and broken it up. I think that's wrong. Gebser knew exactly what he was doing. And the integral has to do with the representation and realization of making everything transparent to the transcendent. The world becomes luminous like stained glass, and you just see the transcendent coming in everywhere, through everything. But it's not a regression. And Gebser knew very well about these other states of consciousness, such as the Hindu idea of Brahman, but he regarded that as regressive. He thought that meant that you were regressing back to the magical, basically with the Hindus, because the cave is the symbol of the magical. And a lot of this stuff in the history of early Indian Buddhism took place in caves, hermits and sages living in caves. So the cave is really key here. I think he's right about that. There might be a regressive element to this idea of attaining Brahman that Wilber totally misses. So he's broken this up into soul and spirit. Soul is the psychic, which he equates with the Buddhist Nirmanakaya and equates that with shamanism. However, as we have just seen, shamanism has to do with the magical consciousness structure. It's not a higher consciousness structure than the magical. The magical is shamanism. Shamanism is the primary mode of accessing the other world, the astral plane. So there's some problems here. Then he moves on to this distinction. Number 6 is the subtle, Sambhogakaya, and saintly. So we have the saintly versus the shamanic. Except that the subtle really has to do with myth and dreaming consciousness. The subtle is the realm of what the Hindus called sukshma, or self-luminous forms. The forms of our dreams are self-luminous, what McLuhan would call light through rather than light on. Whereas the forms of the outer world and waking consciousness, McLuhan would say that's light on, and the Hindus would say that's sthula, gross material form. They have to be illuminated by the sun. They're not self-luminous. So that doesn't really work. The subtle has to do with dreaming, the level of consciousness, the mythical level of consciousness. And then he's got 7, the causal, Dharmakaya, which is sagely. But actually, the causal level has to do with deep dreamless sleep. Deep dreamless sleep is the realm where everything is unified in a kind of embryonic one. And those are the causal zones from out of which the energies unfold into dreaming and into waking. Now, I think he's missed a point here. What Gebser has done in his ever-present origin, in seeing the entire history of humanity as this awakening to consciousness, he's been very influenced by the Upanishads here, and he's somewhat borrowed their model, that everything is like this lotus that awakens and opens up, and human evolution has become more and more and more awake, and I think he's right about this, where he has the archaic consciousness structure, which corresponds in the Upanishads to what is called Turiya, the silence, from out of which these other 3 come. Those other 3 are the causal level of deep dreamless sleep, which comes out of that. Deep dreamless sleep, which is formless and non-dual, no self-luminous forms, it's just a kind of a dark cave. Then you get the mythical consciousness structure, which corresponds to the dreaming level, where all the forms are subtle. Subtle, self-luminous, like bioluminescent fish at the bottom of the sea. They light up in that darkness. And then from out of that corresponds to the dreaming level in the Upanishads, and then from out of that comes the waking level, which is the level of the mental consciousness structure that the Greeks and the Jews were the first to figure out. And so we have this idea, and those can be translated into the gods, the Hindu gods. They like to conceptually translate their ideas into gods. Deep dreamless sleep corresponds to Shiva. Dreaming consciousness corresponds to Vishnu, whose dream is the nightmare of world history, as Joyce said. And the level of waking consciousness corresponds to the god Brahma, who comes up out of the lotus and with his 4 faces radiates the light of waking consciousness out into the 4 quarters. That's waking consciousness. Okay, so that's how Gebser figured out his model as a way of trumping Jung. He was in an agon with Jung. He was there at Basel teaching to Jungians, but I think that Jung was the great master. And he had an idea here that he wanted to use to because he thought Jung missed this with this dumping of everything into this archetypal collective unconscious, which becomes just this sort of gigantic midden heap for all the world's adjunct religious signifiers that just sort of get tossed down in there, as McLuhan said about Jung. So then we have the ultimate, number 8 is the absolute. That's the ultimate ground of being. Now, so the next section, Wilber says that all of this is what he calls the Atman Project. And he thinks that there's an average level of human consciousness which has sort of evolved in a dumb, blind, instinctual way on its own through this process. And then there are those gifted individuals, yogis, sannyasins, satori Zen teachers, and all of that, who have experienced these other levels. There are the ones who are ahead of the game and who have taught everyone these different modes of transformation and their basic religions. They came out of the Axial Age, as Karl Jaspers said, in which the Axial Age spreads from about 700 BC down to 200 BC, and in which we got all the world's prophets like Pythagoras and Confucius and Lao Tzu, Yajnavalkya, all these prophets going across the board, reacting against the first generation of civilization. And he fails to make a distinction here that is absolutely crucial and essential that Toynbee makes between 3 different generations of civilization, in which the first generation has to do with an overlap amongst the Egyptians and the Sumerians, whose civilization is basically a fusion of the magical with the mythical. They're together there, which is, I think, something that Gebser should have made a little more clear. I think this is missing in Gebser, these overlaps. The Egyptians were mythical. They had a wonderful theogony, but they also were intensely magical. The only way that you could navigate your way through the Egyptian afterlife was by knowing the correct spells. All you had to do was utter the right word and the door would open for you. It had nothing to do with ethics, nothing to do, as it did later in Christianity, with damnation or anything like that. You simply had to know the spells. So there's a very heavy overlay of the magical with the mythical in consideration of the Egyptian, the first generation of civilization. And then the second generation, I think, is an overlap with the mythical and the mental. It begins with the Homeric world, and the Jewish world of the Old Testament is basically mythical, but the intellect is coming into being. It's embryonic, and you can see it comes into being with the Greeks and the Jews and the evolution of philosophy out of religion, and later in the Hellenistic period, science evolving out of philosophy, just as it did all over again with our high Faustian civilization. So that's the second, and then the third generation comes in with Christianity and Islam in that whole world that we're still living in now. And I think these are very useful distinctions to make that Wilber doesn't know about because he hasn't read much history. He doesn't know much about history. And he certainly hasn't spent the time examining each one of these civilizations in detail so that he could understand the context of these ideas. He's just looking to build, he's grabbing bricks to build his own ziggurat, which is a psychological ziggurat that only exists in his mind. Some of it's right, a lot of it isn't. And it's an example on the turn of the spiral of history now of what in the Hellenistic and late classical period was called syncretism. And syncretism was when we got, during that period, the global ecumeny that we've retrieved now in the turn of the spiral as globalization, where all these different civilizations were bringing in all their religious signifiers and they just got mashed up together to create weird syncretistic cults like the Sol Invictus cult or the cult of the god Eon. All of these weird cults made up of signifiers drawn from all these colliding cultures. And I think that's what Wilber is. He's that type of phenomenon on the turn of the spiral and appears at about the same time as what Spengler called the second religiousness that corresponds with the rise of Caesarism, which we're seeing unfolding right now. So I think that's basically what he's doing here. One final thing is that in this chapter he talks about Ernst Becker's idea of the denial of death, that we have a problem in this civilization with death. This is the first civilization in history that has denied the existence of the afterlife, which is an absurdity, and it's rather unbelievable that we have allowed science to bully us and intimidate us into believing that the afterlife doesn't exist. That's dead wrong. I can tell you that now. And so we've allowed that to happen, and science has become this bully that, well, if the dogmatic materialists say that's true, I guess they must know. They're wrong. Okay. So there is a denial of death that's going on here, and I think it's useful to bring in for a moment Borkenau, Franz Borkenau's theory. He was an Austrian theoretician. He started out as a Marxist, but I think he had studied Toynbee and Spengler very thoroughly, and he picked up Toynbee's idea about these three different generations of civilization, and he created this model about this oscillation between two different modes of death in these civilizations, death transcendence versus death acceptance. And he says that in the first generation of civilization with the Egyptians and the Sumerians, basically what you have there is death transcendence. The afterworld is lit up for them. For the Egyptians, it's very brightly lit. It's like one of our cities with all the electricity in it. It was great. They loved it. That was the first generation of death transcendence. They were obsessed with the afterlife in that first generation. In the second generation, though, with the Greeks and the Jews, the afterworld, the other world goes dark. The Homeric heroes, when they go down into the underworld, find a dark, gloomy place of twittering, ineffectual shades. The Jews didn't care either. They dumped it all into a midden heap called Sheol that they weren't interested much in. And so we get this idea in the second generation of civilization of this sort of death acceptance. Yeah, we just accept it. We're not particularly interested in that. Then with Christianity, that the third generation of civilization, it comes back to the death transcending idea again, where the afterworld, the afterlife becomes extremely important once again for that whole Christian, Gnostic, Neoplatonic world that unfolded out of late antiquity there. Then back again with the Renaissance and its pragmatism and its love of Platonic ideas, but yet the afterworld goes dark and it becomes once again a kind of death accepting society. Except that now, at the end of history where we're at now, society has now become a death-denying civilization for the first time because it's allowed science to bully everyone into believing that there is no such thing as reincarnation or the existence of the soul or God or the afterlife. That's all wrong. So there's this idea at the end of the chapter of death denial that needs to be overcome. But he's got a problem in this. He's got these 3 questions at the end of this chapter. And the first one says, what are the major forms of real transcendence available to men and women? That is, are true paths to Atman, to the superconscious, available? And so, of course, absolutely they are. They were made available during the axial age when we got the prophets, Lao Tzu and Pythagoras and Plato and all these guys instructing us about how to access the absolute, how to access the divine. And secondly, he says, well, failing that, what substitutes for transcendence are created? That is, what are the forms of the Atman Project, both subjective as self and objective as culture? I think he's made a big mistake here. He's got this idea that culture is in the way of the human being's ability to access the absolute. That's totally wrong. The evolution of culture and history has come about in such a way to facilitate the human means of jacking into the divine. There's no other way to do it but without culture giving us the codes that instruct us to make it possible, whether it's through yoga, through Chinese alchemy, through Taoism, through Egyptian magic and religion, whatever the mode happens to be of accessing the absolute, it has come through culture. Culture isn't a substitute for transcendence. That's wrong. Culture creates the possibility of the human being for accessing transcendence. So he's got a bad idea here. It's not a good one. But we'll leave it there. That brings us to the end of the introduction, and we'll move on from there. By the way, I have a Patreon account up. If anyone's interested in donating and keeping these videos alive and going, I would appreciate the contribution, however modest or small. So that's I'll put the Patreon link here in the video. Thank you.